The radio crackled with static as Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood aboard the massive battleship Yamato, his weathered hands gripping the steel railing. The Pacific stretched endlessly before him, deceptively calm under the June 4, 1942 dawn. Behind him, the greatest naval armada Japan had ever assembled cut through the dark waters, 4 aircraft carriers, 11 battleships, 16 cruisers, and 46 destroyers. The combined fleet represented the pinnacle of Japanese naval power, yet Yamamoto's eyes held the weight of a man who understood the terrible arithmetic of war. "Admiral, the advance force has reached their positions," reported Captain Kuroshima, his voice carrying the crisp efficiency that had helped orchestrate Japan's stunning victories at Pearl Harbor and across the Pacific. The plan was audacious in its scope. A diversionary attack on the Aleutian Islands would draw American forces north, while the main strike force would capture Midway Atoll and destroy what remained of the United States Pacific Fleet. It was to be the decisive blow that would force America to negotiate peace and secure Japan's Pacific Empire. Yamamoto nodded, but his mind drifted to the intelligence reports that had crossed his desk. The Americans had been rebuilding faster than anticipated. Their industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, dwarfed Japan's ability to replace losses. This operation, dubbed Operation Midway Island, represented, perhaps, the last opportunity to achieve victory before America's sleeping giant fully awakened. The admiral had argued against the attack, preferring to consolidate gains and force a defensive battle. But the Imperial Navy's younger officers burned with the fever of recent victories. 300 miles to the southeast, Vice Admiral Kiichi Nagamo commanded the Kido Butai, the carrier-striking force that had brought devastation to Pearl Harbor. The 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, represented the finest naval aviation in the world. Their pilots, veterans of campaigns from China to Ceylon, were the elite of the elite. As dawn broke across the flight decks, mechanics performed final checks on the Nakajima B-5 and torpedo bombers and Asichi D-3 dive bombers that would soon rain destruction upon Midway. The Japanese had every reason for confidence. In 6 months of warfare, they had swept aside every opponent, conquering territory from the Aleutians to the edge of Australia. Their naval aviators had proven superior to every enemy they had encountered. The Zero fighters dominated the skies, their pilots achieving kill ratios that seemed impossible. The doctrine of decisive battle, deeply ingrained in Japanese naval thinking since Admiral Togo's victory over the Russian fleet at Tsushima in 1905, seemed vindicated by their string of victories. Yet as the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the carrier decks, a different kind of preparation was taking place 1,500 miles away. On the tiny coral atoll of Midway, Marine defenders checked their weapons and scanned the horizon. They knew the Japanese were coming. American codebreakers had penetrated the enemy's communications, revealing not just the timing, but the composition of the approaching fleet. The trap was being set, though neither side yet understood who would be the hunter and who the prey. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine the fate of the Pacific War, where steel ambition would meet desperate resolve in the crucible of battle. Lieutenant Commander Joseph Rochefort bent over the intercept sheets in the basement of the 14th Naval District Headquarters in Pearl Harbor, his eyes bloodshot from weeks of 18-hour days. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead as he and his team of cryptanalysts worked through the labyrinth of Japanese naval codes. They had achieved the impossible, breaking the enemy's most secure communication cipher, designated JN-25 by American intelligence. The intercepts painted a clear picture. A massive Japanese fleet was heading toward a target designated AF in their communications. The breakthrough had come through clever deception. Rochefort's team had instructed Midway to send a false radio message about their water purification system malfunctioning. Within days, Japanese communications intercepted references to AF having water problems. The target was confirmed Midway Atoll, the tiny strategic outpost that served as America's forward base in the Central Pacific. Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet, studied the intelligence summaries with the calm demeanor that had earned him the respect of subordinates and superiors alike. The Japanese plan was ambitious, a diversionary attack on Dutch Harbor in Alaska, followed by the main assault on Midway. 4 Japanese carriers would approach from the northwest, supported by the most powerful battleship force ever assembled. It was clearly intended as the decisive battle that would break American resistance in the Pacific, but Nimitz had advantages beyond intelligence. American industry was reaching full wartime production, and new ships were joining the fleet monthly. More importantly, he had commanders who understood that this battle would require new thinking. Rear Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher commanded Task Force 17, centered on the carrier Yorktown, hastily repaired after damage sustained in the Coral Sea battle just weeks earlier. Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance led Task Force 16 with the carriers Enterprise and Hornet, their flight decks loaded with every available aircraft, according to naval historians, accounts documented in Samuel Eliot Morrison's comprehensive Pacific War Chronicles. The American preparation represented a fundamental shift in naval warfare philosophy. Unlike the Japanese, who still envisioned decisive battleship encounters, American planners understood that carrier aviation would determine the outcome. The 3 American carriers carried fewer aircraft than their Japanese counterparts, but they would fight from carefully chosen positions with the advantage of land-based air support from Midway itself. On Midway Atoll, 1,200 miles west of Hawaii, Marine and Navy personnel prepared for the onslaught. The tiny Coral Islands, Eastern Island and Sand Island, connected by a narrow causeway, supported a crucial airfield that extended American reach deep into the Pacific. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Shannon commanded the 6th Marine Defense Battalion, whose coastal artillery and anti-aircraft guns would provide the last line of defense. Major Lofton Henderson led Marine Scout Bombing Squadron 241, equipped with obsolescent Brewster Buffalo fighters and Douglas Dauntless dive bombers. The defenders knew they were outnumbered and outgunned. Their aircraft were largely obsolete compared to the Japanese Zeros and their newest bombers. Yet they possessed something equally valuable: time to prepare and the knowledge that the enemy was coming. Ammunition was distributed, fuel tanks were filled, and every available aircraft was made ready for combat. The Marines had learned hard lessons from Wake Island and other early battles. They would not be caught unprepared. As June 4th dawned, clear and bright, both sides made their final preparations. The Japanese striking force approached from the northwest, their carriers launching reconnaissance flights to locate American forces. The pilots were confident, their aircraft superior, their tactics proven in victory after victory. They had no reason to suspect that their most secure communications had been compromised, or that 3 American carrier task forces were already positioning themselves for the battle that would determine the course of the Pacific War. At 4:30 on the morning of June 4th, 1942, the pre-dawn darkness aboard the carrier Akagi erupted with the controlled chaos of flight operations. Vice Admiral Nagumo's Chief of Staff, Commander Minoru Genda, watched as 108 aircraft prepared for launch: 36 Nakajima B-5 bombers, 36 Aichi D-3 dive bombers, and 36 Zero fighters. The target was Midway Atoll, that tiny speck of coral that served as America's forward outpost in the Central Pacific. Lieutenant Joichi Tominaga led the first wave, his bomber heavy with ordnance as it lifted off from Akagi's flight deck. Behind him, aircraft from Kagasoryu and Hiryu joined the formation, their engines creating a thunderous symphony that could be heard for miles across the Pacific. The Japanese pilots were supremely confident. They had not lost a major engagement since Pearl Harbor, and their aircraft were superior to anything the Americans could field. Meanwhile, Nagumo retained half his aircraft for a potential second, strike or to deal with any American naval forces that might appear. The doctrine of maintaining a reserve was sound, but it would prove costly. On the flight decks of his 4 carriers, mechanics prepared another wave of aircraft, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes specifically designed for attacking ships rather than land targets. The radar station on Midway detected the incoming formation at 5:20, while the Japanese aircraft were still 150 miles out. Air raid sirens wailed across the tiny atoll as Marines and sailors ran to their battle stations. Major Lofton Henderson scrambled every available Fighter 26 aircraft in total, including obsolescent booster Buffalo fighters that were no match for the Japanese Zeros in single combat. At 6:16, Tomonaga's formation reached Midway. The Japanese pilots, veterans of campaigns across the Pacific, executed their attack with professional precision. Dive bombers screamed down on the airfield facilities while level bombers targeted the fuel storage tanks and barracks. The anti-aircraft fire was intense but largely ineffective against the experienced Japanese pilots who had faced similar defenses from Pearl Harbor to Darwin. Major Henderson led his fighters into the formation, knowing that his Buffalo fighters were outclassed but determined to exact whatever price he could. The aerial battle was savage and brief. Henderson's aircraft was hit by Zero fighters and crashed into the ocean, taking with it one of the Marine Corps' most experienced pilots. Other fighters fell in rapid succession, their inferior performance no match for Japanese training and equipment. Yet the sacrifice was not in vain. The Marine fighters disrupted the Japanese bombing runs, forcing several aircraft to jettison their loads prematurely. More importantly, they demonstrated to the Japanese that Midway would not be easily subdued. When Tomonaga's formation finally withdrew, the runways were damaged but still operational, and most of the fuel storage remained intact. At 7 o'clock, Tomonaga radioed his assessment to Nagamo. There is need for a second attack. The message would prove fateful. The Japanese admiral faced a crucial decision: commit his reserve aircraft to finish Midway, or maintain them in case American naval forces appeared. Unknown to Nagamo, American carriers were already approaching, their scout planes searching for his fleet. The first phase of the battle had ended with a tactical victory for the Japanese, but strategic implications were already emerging. Midway remained operational, its defenders bloodied but not broken. More ominously for the Japanese, their formation had been detected by American patrol aircraft at 7:10, revealing the location of Nagamo's carriers to the American fleet. Commanders who had been searching for exactly this opportunity. As the morning sun climbed higher over the Pacific, the stage was set for the decisive carrier battle that would determine not just the fate of Midway, but the entire course of the Pacific War. The Japanese had struck first, but the advantage of surprise was slipping away with each passing minute. Aboard the flagship Akagi, Vice Admiral Nagamo faced the most critical decision of his naval career. Lieutenant Tomonaga's radio message requesting a second strike on Midway had arrived at 7 o'clock, but conflicting intelligence reports clouded the tactical picture. At 7:28, the cruiser Tone's reconnaissance aircraft reported sighting American ships to the northeast, though the pilot had not yet identified their composition. Were they merely support vessels, or did they include the carriers that could threaten his entire operation? Commander Minoru Genda, architect of the Pearl Harbor attack, urged immediate action against the newly discovered American ships. His reasoning was sound: carriers represented the primary threat to the Japanese fleet, and they should be engaged before they could launch their own aircraft. But Nagamo's first-wave aircraft were already being rearmed in the hangars below deck, their anti-ship torpedoes and armor-piercing bombs replaced with high-explosive ordnance for the planned second attack on Midway. The Japanese admiral hesitated, a pause that would echo through history. At 7:45, he ordered the aircraft to be rearmed once again, this time with anti-ship weapons. The process was complex and time-consuming. Torpedoes and bombs had to be manually wheeled out of storage while the high-explosive ordnance was returned to the magazines. Across 4 flight decks, hundreds of sailors worked frantically to prepare for a different kind of battle than they had anticipated. Naval warfare. Historian Gordon Prange documented in his authoritative account, Miracle at Midway, that this rearming process created a critical vulnerability. Japanese carriers, unlike their American counterparts, stored ordnance in hangars rather than in armored magazines. Bombs and torpedoes lay scattered across the hangar decks, connected by fuel lines and surrounded by the volatile aviation gasoline that powered the aircraft engines. At 8 o'clock, Scout 4 from the carrier Enterprise, piloted by Lieutenant Howard 80, spotted the Japanese fleet. His radio message was brief but electrifying. Enemy carriers bearing 320 degrees. Distance 180 miles. The location was transmitted to Admiral Spruance aboard Enterprise and Admiral Fletcher on Yorktown, giving them the target they had been seeking since dawn. The American response was immediate and overwhelming. Enterprise and Hornet began launching aircraft at 7 o'clock, even before receiving confirmation of the Japanese position. Yorktown, still conducting recovery operations for her morning patrol, would launch her attack group an hour later. In total, 156 American aircraft would participate in the assault torpedo bombers, dive bombers, and fighters, representing nearly every operational aircraft in the Pacific Fleet. But the Americans faced their own challenges. The various squadrons became separated during the flight to the target, destroying the coordinated attack plan. Torpedo Squadron 8 from Hornet, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, approached the Japanese fleet alone. Waldron's 15 Douglas Devastator torpedo bombers were obsolescent aircraft, slow and vulnerable to fighter attack. They had no fighter escort and faced the full fury of Japanese air defenses. The slaughter was complete and terrible. Japanese Zero fighters, directed by radar operators who had perfected their skills in months of combat, intercepted the torpedo bombers before they could reach attack position. One by one, the Devastators fell into the Pacific, their crews dying. In aircraft that had been obsolete before the war began. Only Ensign George Gay survived, floating in his life jacket as the battle raged overhead. Similar fates befell Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise and Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown. The American torpedo attacks were brave but futile, achieving no hits while losing 35 of 41 aircraft committed to the assault. Japanese fighter pilots, veterans of campaigns from China to Ceylon, demonstrated the superiority that had made them the terror of the Pacific. Yet the torpedo attacks, though failing in their primary mission, achieved something crucial. They drew Japanese fighters down to sea level, disrupting the enemy's defensive coordination. More importantly, they fixed the attention of Japanese air controllers on the immediate threat, preventing them from detecting the dive bombers that were approaching from higher altitudes. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons was creating the opportunity for victory, though none of the dying aircrew could have known it at the time. Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey pushed his Douglas Dauntless dive bomber through the crystalline Pacific sky, his fuel gauge registering dangerously low levels. As commander of Enterprise Air Group, he led 37 dive bombers that had been searching for the Japanese fleet for over 2 hours. The original navigation plot had been incorrect, and McCluskey had made the crucial decision to continue searching rather than return to his carrier with bombs. UNEXPEND ED. At 10:22 in the morning of June 4, 1942, McCluskey spotted the telltale wake of a Japanese destroyer racing northeast. The vessel was the Arashi, commanded by Captain Yasumasa Watanabe, hurrying to rejoin the main fleet after depth charging the submarine USS Nautilus. Following the destroyer's course, McCluskey's pilots suddenly saw the sight they had been searching. For 4 Japanese aircraft carriers steaming in a neat box formation, their flight decks crowded with aircraft preparing for launch. The timing was perfect and terrible. Aboard the carriers Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu, the rearming process was nearly complete. Nakajima B-5 and torpedo bombers and Aichi D-3 a dive. Bombers sat on the flight decks, their engines warming for the strike against the American fleet. In the hangars below, ordnance crews worked frantically to prepare additional aircraft, the decks littered with bombs, torpedoes, and fuel lines, a volatile mixture that would prove catastrophic. McCluskey's dive bombers attacked from 14,000 feet, their approach undetected by Japanese radar operators who were focused on the sea-level threat from American torpedo bombers. The dauntless aircraft, though not the most advanced dive bombers in the world, were sturdy and accurate in the hands of experienced pilots. As they pushed over into their 70-degree dives, the Japanese fleet's fate was sealed. Lieutenant Richard Best, leading the 2nd Division of bombers, selected the carrier Akagi as his target. The flagship of Vice Admiral Nagamo represented the heart of Japanese naval aviation, carrying the staff that had planned the Pearl Harbor attack. Best's 1,000-pound bomb struck near the aircraft elevator, penetrating the flight deck and exploding. In the hangar among the rearming aircraft, secondary explosions rippled through the ship as aviation gasoline ignited and bomb storage areas detonated simultaneously. Other dive bombers targeted the carrier Kaiga. Lieutenant Edwin Kroger's bomb hit directly amidships, while additional strikes created inferno that consumed the ship's aviation facilities. The carrier, veteran of campaigns from Pearl Harbor to the Indian Ocean, was transformed into a floating funeral pyre within minutes. Her captain, Jisaku Okada, would go down with his ship, maintaining the traditions of the Imperial Navy even as his command disintegrated around him. The 3rd carrier, Soryu, fell victim to dive bombers from Yorktown under Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Leslie. 3 direct hits transformed the carrier into a blazing wreck, her aviation gasoline creating towering columns of black smoke that could be seen for 50 miles. Captain Ryusaku Yanagimoto refused evacuation, choosing to die with his ship rather than survive the destruction of his command. In the space of 5 minutes, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been reduced to burning hulks. The cream of Japanese naval aviation pilots who had trained for years and gained experience in countless battles died trapped in aircraft that exploded before they could take off. The carefully assembled strike force that was to have finished off the American Pacific Fleet instead became funeral pyres drifting across the Pacific. Only the carrier Hiryu, positioned several miles from her sister ships, escaped the initial assault. Her captain, Tomio Kaku, immediately ordered a counterattack with every available aircraft. The Japanese were not finished fighting, and their response would be swift and devastating. But the balance of power in the Pacific had already shifted. Japan's margin of naval superiority, built painstakingly over decades and proven in 6 months of victories, had been erased in a single morning's work. The miracle at 10:22 had occurred not through divine intervention, but through the combination of accurate intelligence, brave sacrifice, and the deadly precision of American dive bombers striking at exactly the right moment. Captain Tomio Kaku stood on the bridge of the carrier Hiryu, the sole surviving Japanese flat top, watching pillars of black smoke rise from his sister ships. Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu were blazing wrecks, their aviation fuel creating towering pyres that stained the Pacific sky. But Kaku was a veteran of Japan's naval campaigns, and he knew that even in disaster, honor demanded counterattack. At 11:30, he ordered the launch of every available aircraft, 18 Aichi D-3 dive bombers and 6 Zero fighters under Lieutenant Michio Kobayashi. The Japanese pilots, though outnumbered and fighting from a position of desperate disadvantage, retained the skill and determination that had made them the terror of the Pacific. Their target was the American carrier Yorktown, damaged in the Battle of the Coral Sea just weeks earlier. but hastily repaired at Pearl Harbor. Admiral Fletcher's flagship represented the heart of American resistance in the Pacific, and her destruction might yet salvage something from the disaster. Aboard Yorktown, radar operators detected the incoming Japanese formation at 11:55. Captain Elliot Buckmaster ordered general quarters, and the carrier's defensive systems prepared for action. Combat air patrol fighters scrambled to intercept, while anti-aircraft gunners manned their weapons. The ship's damage control parties, trained through hard experience in the early battles of the war, prepared for the worst. The aerial battle was fierce but brief. American Grumman F-4F Wildcats, though inferior to Japanese Zeros in maneuverability, fought with the desperation of men defending their homes. Several Japanese aircraft fell to the defensive fighters, but Kobayashi's remaining bombers pressed their attack with the fatalistic courage that characterized Japanese naval aviation. At 12:20, 3 bombs struck Yorktown in rapid succession. The first penetrated the flight deck and exploded in the hangar, starting fires among the stored aircraft. The second hit destroyed the ship's radar facilities, blinding her to further air attacks. The third bomb most critically damaged the boiler uptakes, reducing the carrier's speed to 6 knots and making her a sitting target for further attacks. Yet, American damage control proved superior to Japanese expectations. Chief Carpenter's mate Charles Kleinsmith led repair parties that contained the fires and restored partial power within 2 hours. By 2 o'clock, Yorktown was making 20 knots and appeared to be recovering from her wounds. The sight of the American carrier regaining speed and resuming flight operations prompted Admiral Nagamo to order a second strike. At 2:45, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga led the second wave from Hiryu-10 Nakajima B-5 and torpedo bombers and 60 fighters. Tomonaga himself was wounded and flying an aircraft damaged in the morning's attack on Midway, but he pressed forward with the same determination that had characterized Japanese naval aviation throughout the war. This would be the final throw of the dice for Nagamo's shattered fleet. The torpedo attack succeeded where the earlier bombing had failed. 2 Type 95 torpedoes struck Yorktown's port side, causing massive flooding and knocking out electrical power. The carrier began listing heavily to port, and Captain Buckmaster reluctantly ordered abandoned ship at 3 o'clock. The evacuation was conducted with exemplary discipline, and most of the crew was saved by escorting destroyers. As documented in contemporary action reports preserved by the Naval Historical Center, the loss of Yorktown represented a severe blow to American naval strength in the Pacific. Admiral Fletcher transferred his flag to the cruiser Astoria, while tactical command passed to Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance aboard Enterprise. The Americans had suffered their first major loss of the battle, but they retained 2 operational carriers against Japan's single remaining flat top. The Japanese counterattack had demonstrated that even in defeat, the Imperial Navy remained a formidable opponent. Hiryu's aircraft had shown that Japanese training and determination could still achieve tactical success even when facing overwhelming odds. But the strategic situation remained desperate for Nagamo's fleet. 3 irreplaceable carriers were lost, their experienced pilots dead or scattered, and American forces still controlled the initiative. As the afternoon wore on, both sides prepared for the final phase of the battle, knowing that the outcome would determine the fate of Japan's Pacific Empire. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Pacific as Rear Admiral Raymond Spruance faced the most crucial decision of his naval career. From the flag bridge of USS Enterprise, he could see the smoke columns from 3 burning Japanese carriers staining the horizon. Intelligence reports indicated that 1 enemy flat top remained operational, and Spruance knew that Hiryu posed a continuing threat to his remaining forces. At 3:30 on June 4, 1942, he ordered the final airstrike that would seal Japan's fate at Midway. Lieutenant Commander Earl Gallagher led 24 dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise, joined by 16 more from the crippled but still fighting Yorktown. The American pilots, exhausted from a day of continuous combat, nevertheless pressed forward with the determination that had characterized their performance throughout the battle. Their target was clear the last Japanese carrier, steaming desperately northward in an attempt to escape the disaster that had befallen her sister ships. Captain Tomio Kaiku, commanding Hiryu, knew his situation was hopeless. His carrier's aircraft complement was virtually exhausted, his fuel running low, and American forces controlled the surrounding seas. Yet he maintained course and speed, preparing for the final confrontation with the fatalistic courage that had defined Japanese naval service since the days of the samurai. His remaining aircraft were armed and ready for one last desperate strike. At 5 o'clock, Gallagher's dive bombers found their target. Hiryu was steaming alone, abandoned by most of her escort vessels as the Japanese fleet began its retreat toward home waters. The carrier's anti-aircraft fire was intense but uncoordinated, many of her gun crews casualties from the day's earlier battles. As the American aircraft pushed over into their attack dives, the fate of Japanese naval aviation hung in the balance. 4 direct hits transformed Hiryu into a blazing wreck within minutes. The carrier's aviation gasoline created the same towering inferno that had consumed her sister ships, while secondary explosions rippled through her hull as bomb storage areas detonated. Captain Kaku, following the tradition of Japanese naval officers, chose to go down with his ship rather than survive the destruction of his command. Admiral Yamamoto, monitoring the battle from his flagship Yamato 300 miles to the west, received the news of Hiryu's destruction at 6:30. The architect of Pearl Harbor realized that his gamble had failed catastrophically. Japan's premier naval striking force, 4 irreplaceable aircraft carriers and their veteran air groups, had been destroyed in a single day. The margin of naval superiority that had enabled Japan's Pacific conquests was gone, never to be recovered. At midnight, Yamamoto issued the order that marked the beginning of Japan's long retreat. The Midway operation is cancelled. All forces will withdraw to base. The combined fleet, assembled with such care and optimism just days earlier, began its limping journey home. Behind them, the waters around Midway were littered with the debris of Japanese ambition-burning carriers, scattered aircraft, and the bodies of pilots who had believed themselves invincible. The strategic implications were immediately apparent to both sides. Japan had lost not just 4 carriers, but over 200 aircraft and their irreplaceable aircrew. The pilot training programs that had produced the elite naval aviators could not quickly replace such losses, while American industrial capacity was reaching full wartime production. Admiral Nimitz's intelligence coup and the tactical brilliance of his subordinate commanders had achieved what many thought impossible: the decisive defeat of Japanese naval power. According to post-war analysis conducted by the U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey, the Battle of Midway marked the turning point of the Pacific War. Japan's ability to conduct offensive operations was permanently crippled, while American confidence and industrial momentum would drive them inexorably toward Tokyo Bay. The empire that had stretched from the Aleutians to the edge of Australia began its contraction on June 4, 1942, when steel ambition met American resolve in the waters around a tiny coral atoll. As dawn broke on June 5, the Pacific belonged to America. Japan's empire had indeed faltered, its flames of conquest extinguished in the waters of Midway, leaving behind only the broken ruins of what had once seemed an invincible naval force. The rising sun had begun its long descent toward the horizon of defeat.